Damien Lockhart could practically feel the weight of his $1 million tuxedo jacket as he stepped out of the gleaming black limousine, its door held open by a discreetly efficient chauffeur. The annual Winter Gala was always an essential date on his calendar, part charitable soirée, part high-stakes networking event, and entirely an opportunity for him to reassure investors of his unwavering command. Tonight, he arrived in a swirl of fine snow drifting from the inky sky, the marquee lights of the Grand Hotel reflecting off the pristine sidewalk. Assistants and PR managers hovered near the entrance, each prepared to guide him smoothly through the throng of reporters and socialites awaiting inside. As the CEO of Lockhart Innovations, his presence was both expected and buzzed about, and he wore the faintly confident smile he had perfected in countless boardrooms. While posing for the cameras, he noted the hush of onlookers who recognized him from business magazines and whisper-laden articles about his swift rise to fortune. He had been labeled a financial savant, rumored to be as cold and methodical in romance as in business. Damien privately accepted such rumors, suspecting that his single-minded drive to dominate the tech sector left little room for real human connection. When paparazzi cried his name, he simply offered a practiced nod, ignoring the sting of each flash in his eyes. An assistant waited for him at the entrance's red carpet edge, reminding him that a table near the center had been reserved, that he should graciously mingle with certain philanthropists, then deliver a short address about the cause the gala championed. Nodding in tight acknowledgement, he prepared himself for another evening of calculated smiles and endless handshakes. Yet something about the swirling hush of falling snow and the glimmering decor unsettled Damien, stirring a faint memory he couldn't quite pin down. It was as if he'd stepped into a chapter of his life he hadn't planned, an ominous undercurrent in an otherwise standard corporate show. Shaking off the disquiet, he gave the PR manager a subtle gesture of readiness, then glided in through the polished brass doors. The hotel's palatial foyer opened before him, marble floors reflecting chandeliers made to mimic delicate icicles, while staff in tailored uniforms offered champagne to the swirl of guests in tuxedos and ball gowns. At first glance, it was all so typical, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that fate lay in wait somewhere among the throng. He spotted a cluster of business associates near a gilded staircase, so he diverted in that direction, mind already conjuring small talk about mergers and market predictions. But while he stepped across the polished floor, weaving elegantly around couples snapping photos, his gaze flicked over a woman by the far corner of the hall. She wore a sleek midnight blue gown that highlighted her slight figure, her hair falling in a cascade of soft waves. Though Damien tried to remain focused on his business acquaintances, he caught the woman's subtle movements out of the corner of his eye, the way she hovered near the refreshments, glancing toward him, then looking away hurriedly, as if mustering courage for something. A faint quiver of curiosity tugged at him. He had no memory of seeing her before, so why did her posture set alarm bells ringing in his mind? Damien forced himself to address a pair of colleagues, exchanging a few polite remarks about technology expansions, trying to quell that uneasy sense of being watched. The woman in midnight blue seemed to fade from thought as he listened to an older investor prattle on about possible acquisitions. But then, just as he nodded blandly to some remark about the unstoppable progress of Lockhart Innovations, the same woman appeared at his periphery again. This time, she stood less than a few steps away, her knuckles tight around a champagne flute. A swirl of emotion flickered in her dark eyes, something like fear, or maybe resolve. With a clipped apology to his associates, Damien pivoted, meeting her gaze fully. His initial annoyance, someone daring to interrupt him, shifted the instant he read the vulnerable determination in her face. He felt oddly disarmed. The hush that formed around them shut out the chaotic hum of the gala, as if they were the only two people in that lavish space. He offered a brisk, polite nod, waiting for her to speak. She opened her mouth, only to hesitate, glancing aside as though grappling with a secret about to break loose. Swallowing visibly, she finally managed to say his name, Damien Lockhart. Her voice quivered on the edges. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. Yes, he replied, tone colored by curiosity. Do I know you? The question emerged more softly than he intended. A flush tinted her cheeks as she tightened her grip on the flute in her hand. The hush between them threatened to burst with tension. People in suits and sequin dresses buzzed around them, yet it was as if the woman existed in a separate sphere of hush and heartbreak. We met once, a long time ago," she admitted, voice almost lost in the swirl of background music. "Only for a night. You might not recall. But I have something important to tell you, something I've kept hidden." Damien frowned, trying to place her face. He had indulged in fleeting affairs years back, but never to the point of letting them last. This woman's quiet intensity hinted at deep significance, stirring unsettled memories he'd locked away. "Come with me," he said in a subdued tone, stepping aside from the main flow of guests. She followed, walking stiffly, like every step might break the fragile calm she'd clung to. His pulse drummed in his ears, that intangible sense of approaching a crossroads he had never foreseen. They reached a quieter alcove near a row of potted evergreens, the sounds of the Gala's music dulling behind the marble pillars. She drew a shaky breath, turning to face him, eyes shining with emotion. "You probably don't remember me," she murmured, voice trembling. "We met at a business conference in Montreal about 5 years ago. It was an impulsive night for both of us. I never planned to see you again. But then, something happened." Her hand went to her small handbag, rummaging for something. Damien remained poised, fists clenched at his sides, uncertain if he dreaded or longed to hear her next words. A single swirl of memory struck him, images of a glitzy after-party, fleeting laughter with a striking stranger whose name he never quite learned. Could it be her? She withdrew a small photograph from her handbag, glancing at it with trembling lips. "I tried to reach you once," she continued, tears rimming her eyes, "but your office blocked me. Then I convinced myself you'd want no part in this. But he's getting older now, asking questions. Damien, you have a son. And I think it's time you knew." She extended the photo, revealing a bright-eyed boy with a grin that carried a faint echo of the Lockhart features, his hair a soft auburn that echoed Damien's. The hush that fell was absolute, a swirl of shock blazing through his composure. He stared, breath strangled. A child. His child. 5 years of fatherhood he had never known. Anger, confusion, guilt, a sudden fierce protective surge, emotions battered him in an instant. His carefully perfected persona threatened to crack, and all the hush of the swirling Gala outside felt miles away. Heart pounding, he managed only a husky, "What's his name?" The woman, her name still unspoken, exhaled a shaky sigh. "Jackson," she answered. "Jackson Caldwell. I gave him my name, since I never believed you'd want to be part of his life, or that you'd even recall me. But I can't keep it from him anymore. He deserves to know his father. And you, if you want, deserve to know him." A single tear slipped down her cheek. In that hush-laden moment, as the winter Gala's lights glimmered overhead, Damien Lockhart came face to face with a reality that shattered his meticulously engineered world. No longer was he simply the unyielding CEO who controlled expansions and acquisitions. He was a father, blindsided by a truth that had quietly existed for 5 years. Standing in a pocket of hush away from the party's noise, he gazed at the photo of a small boy who bore his features, grappling with a future he had never anticipated. A swirl of half-formed questions tumbled through his mind: how, when, why hadn't he known? But one certainty emerged through the confusion: the hush was over. His life would never be the same again. Damien Lockhart stood with his chest constricting, the chilly air of the winter Gala's entry hall swirling around him. Everything else, the bustle of donors swirling in beaded gowns, the subdued clink of champagne flutes, faded into the background. He stared at the photograph in the woman's hand, unable to tear his eyes away from the bright-eyed little boy who bore his likeness in the tilt of his chin, the shape of his brow. Just minutes earlier, Damien had been exchanging polite, forgettable pleasantries with potential investors, an unshakable CEO on display. Now, in a matter of breaths, He felt as if an uncharted path had opened beneath his feet, the path of fatherhood, an identity he had never expected to claim. The woman, her name was Tamsin, though it took him several seconds to recall, trembled visibly, her slender shoulders rigid beneath a sleek midnight blue gown. He noticed the faint tear tracks on her cheeks, the reined-in emotion that threatened to spill over. She had once been an afterthought in his memory, a fleeting acquaintance at a business conference, someone who'd shared a spontaneous evening of laughter and comforting conversation before they parted ways forever. To think that night had led to the existence of a child. Guilt and confusion warred in Damien's chest. Tamsin pressed the photo into his hand, her expression flickering between resolve and heartbreak. "He's 5, she repeated softly, as though the words might anchor them both to the reality. "His name is Jackson. I never wanted to blindside you like this, but I had no idea how else to reach you." The kaleidoscope of emotions swirling through Damien's mind made him feel strangely vulnerable. He was used to controlling every factor in his life, commanding the loyalty of an empire of employees and the adoration of board members. Now, he was left reeling by an unfamiliar pang of shame. 5 years. 5 years of first words, first steps, laughter, tears, milestones he had never witnessed, a boy he had never held. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" he found himself asking, voice lower than usual. His question wasn't an accusation but a wounded plea, the only anchor he could cling to in the surge of new reality. He thought of the countless phone calls his assistant screened, the countless messages he disregarded if they weren't marked with corporate significance. Perhaps he had missed Tamsin's attempt at contact. Or perhaps she had never tried, too frightened or convinced he wouldn't care. She lowered her gaze, fiddling with the seam of her gown. "I was scared," she admitted, swallowing. "You're Damien Lockhart, the unstoppable force of your industry. We only shared one night, and I believed you'd dismiss me, or that you'd think I was only after your wealth. I had enough on my plate, dealing with pregnancy alone." Her cheeks darkened at the memory. "So I made do without you. I raised Jackson the best I could. We manage okay, but lately, he's old enough to notice the fathers of other children at school. He asks questions. I couldn't keep pretending forever." Damien's grip on the photo tightened, his gaze lingering on the boy's playful grin. Jackson's wide, curious eyes stared back at him, forging an invisible link that Damien could not deny. Disjointed images filled his thoughts: car rides to soccer practice, reading bedtime stories, teaching a child how to hold a pen and sign their name. All illusions, for now, but illusions that might materialize if Tamsin was telling the truth. He inhaled a shaky breath, the swirling ambience of the winter gala still humming behind his shoulder, reminding him that dozens of influential guests were likely noticing his extended absence. I need time," he said finally, meeting Tamsin's eyes. "I'm not questioning the validity of what you're saying, but this changes everything. My entire life, my entire plan, it all needs rethinking." A glimmer of disappointment passed over Tamsin's face, but understanding followed. "I know," she murmured. "I'm not demanding anything tonight, or expecting you to publicly claim him. I just needed you to know he exists. Jackson deserves the chance to know who his father is. But if you're certain you can't, or won't, be part of that, I can't force you." That final statement twisted something deep within Damien's soul. The notion of having a child and then rejecting him out of convenience or fear felt abhorrent, even though fatherhood was a role he had never envisioned. Pride pricked at him too. How many business conquests had he racked up, how many deals had he won against formidable opponents, yet here he was quailing at the notion of a small boy's love and trust. He managed to place a hand gently on Tamsin's shoulder, ignoring the flicker of shock that raced through her eyes at the unexpected softness in his gesture. "I won't walk away without giving Jackson a chance to know me," he said, the words forming a vow he hardly recognized himself making. "And I'd like to meet him, talk with you more, figure out how to handle this." Relief flooded Tamsin's expression, although a vestige of wariness remained. "Thank you," she whispered. "We can set up a meeting, somewhere quiet, no paparazzi. I don't want him hounded by cameras if word gets out that he's your son." She swallowed, glancing around the grand foyer. The glittering crowd, the swirling lights, the chatter, it felt incongruous to be discussing such a monumental, life-altering secret in the middle of a lavish charity function. "We can pick a time next week. I'm in town a few more days for work. After that, I'd be happy to show you where we live." Her final words trembled slightly, as if she hardly believed he was receptive. Dimly, Damien recalled that he still had a speech to deliver, a scene to maintain. In a few minutes, society's gaze would require he stand behind a microphone, championing a philanthropic cause. But his mind was here, pinned on the Polaroid in his grasp, a bright-eyed little boy. Fatherhood. It sounded surreal, wrong, but also stirred a flickering sense of wonder. Awe, even. He nodded at Tamsin with quiet resolve. "Let me handle some obligations here," he said, "and we'll talk soon. I want your number, and I want the chance to meet him properly, not in a swirl of cameras." She blinked back fresh tears, rummaging in her small purse for a slip of paper. With shaky hands, she scrawled her phone number and address, passing it to him like an emotional lifeline. "Thank you for listening," she managed, voice tight. I'm sorry to spring this on you in such a setting, but I couldn't let more years pass in silence. He's a wonderful boy, Damien. He deserves the best father he can have, even if it means just a little bit of your time." Her eyes shone with quiet desperation, mixing apology and hope. Summoning all his self-control, Damien forced a faint, steady smile. "We'll figure this out," he said, not entirely sure how, but unwilling to abandon a child that was his flesh and blood. With that, Tamsin quietly slipped away into the throng. He watched her vanish among the swirl of tuxedos and gowns, once again just another attendee at a massive gala. Yet inside his heart, a riot roared, rewriting the script of the evening. Clutching the photo and the piece of paper with her number, he inhaled, ignoring the way his chest felt tight. He had faced hostile CEOs, unscrupulous rivals, and worldwide financial storms, but none of that prepared him for the jolt of fatherhood. Even the hush of the lavish hall felt different now, as if the entire building hushed in anticipation of Damien's next move. A tap on his shoulder brought him back to the present, his assistant, nervously reminding him of the impending speech. Damien nodded, composing himself as best he could. He realized how trivial that philanthropic address suddenly felt compared to the secret that now pulsed in his mind, a small boy named Jackson, awaiting knowledge of a father he had never met. But he was a consummate professional. He stepped onto the small stage in the grand ballroom, ignoring the clapping and the swirl of cameras, and delivered polished remarks about generosity, the importance of funding the Gala's cause, and the philanthropic endeavors Lockhart Industries was proud to champion. All the while, his voice remained steady, but his mind reeled. He caught Tamsin's form near the back of the crowd, half hidden behind a tall arrangement of winter flowers. Her eyes flicked to him, resonating with relief and caution, as if each unsure whether the fresh vow they'd formed would hold in the glare of day. He ended the speech swiftly, stepping down to a mild applause from the audience, a standard reaction to a philanthropic statement. Then, with the final nod to organizers, he slipped away, evading the onrush of socialites who wanted his ear. Clambering into his waiting limousine, he sank against the plush leather seat, running a hand over his face. The hush inside the car seemed overwhelming, his reflection in the tinted window a stranger's, someone possibly about to become a father figure. As the limousine pulled away from the winter gala, the swirl of city lights blurred by, and Damien recalled the photograph's little face. For once, he had no immediate plan or strategic outline. He only had a scrap of paper with Tamsin's number and a Polaroid that told him the life he had built so carefully was incomplete. He pressed his eyes shut, uncertain if fatherhood would bring the downfall he feared or if, just possibly, it would fill a quiet void he had always felt but never acknowledged. The hush of the drive back to his penthouse offered no answers, only the promise of a choice he could no longer dodge. He resolved, somewhere in that hush, that he would not allow fear to define his next steps, that he would at least meet the little boy who wore his face and name, and no matter the swirl of consequences, he would face them with the unwavering will that made him Damien Lockhart. Damien awoke to a morning awash in an unsettling hush, the usual clamor of his phone's overnight updates muted by the weight of his newest revelation. He had returned from the winter gala well after midnight, spent and anxious, unable to shake the image of Jackson's bright smile from his thoughts. Now, hours later, he stood in his penthouse's glass-walled living area, coffee cup in hand, staring out at the city skyline. The view, a sprawl of steel and concrete shimmering with early sun, normally anchored him, reminding him of the empire he commanded. Today, it merely underscored how alien his life had become in the span of one evening. A father. The word pulsed in his mind with a gravity he had never imagined bearing. He checked his phone, an habitual gesture. Usually, he found comfort in scanning messages from executives or reviewing the latest expansions of Lockhart Industries. Yet this morning, the only thing that truly mattered was the slip of paper in his jacket pocket, bearing Tamsin's phone number and a short address. He remembered the hush of her voice, the tremor that turned every word into a plea: meet your son, know him, see if you can be part of his world. The recollection flooded him with conflicting sensations: guilt at having missed Jackson's first 5 years, indignation that Tamsin had not forced him to know sooner, and a raw flutter of excitement at the notion of stepping beyond his carefully walled life. Rubbing the tension in his brow, he debated calling immediately. Yet caution held him back. What if this was a mistake, or a trap laid by a cunning mother seeking to exploit his fortune? Even as the question formed, shame rushed in. Tamsin's tear-filled eyes had not spoken of greed. She had looked as though the burden of solitude had weighed heavily on her soul, relieved only by the faint hope in his reaction. He finished his coffee in brooding silence, ignoring the swirl of incoming messages about market fluctuations and a possible competitor's move. Eventually, he dressed in a trim gray suit, instructions to his staff truncated and uncharacteristically vague: I have personal matters. Reschedule the morning brief. His top assistant, used to precise instructions, blinked but obeyed. Not for the first time, Damien felt tension coil in his gut. A single phone call to Tamsin might set in motion a cascade of events that would upend everything. But the alternative, doing nothing, felt impossible. By noon, with the city now fully awake, he found himself in his private car, instructing the driver to take him across town to a modest neighborhood, the address scrawled on that slip of paper. Each mile hammered home how drastically his life's trajectory had shifted in under 24 hours. When the vehicle finally slowed to a stop on a quiet, tree-lined street of tidy houses, Damien sat frozen in the hush of the back seat, struggling to breathe against the onslaught of nerves. The houses here looked unassuming and warm, starkly contrasting the sleek lines of his luxurious penthouse. He pictured a child's bedroom filled with bright-colored toys and scrawled drawings, artifacts of a life that had grown unbeknownst to him. Steeling himself, he slid out of the car, instructing the driver to wait. His footsteps sounded oddly loud on the sidewalk as he approached a charming little house whose porch sported a small swing and potted flowers, half wilted in the winter air. Another wave of conflicting emotions crashed through him, a sense of intrusion into Tamsin's carefully protected world, a flicker of longing to see the boy, to confirm tangibly that he had a son. He exhaled and knocked, heartbeat pounding. After a moment, the door cracked open. Tamsin peered out, her eyes widening at the sight of him. A flurry of emotion flashed across her face: relief, anxiety, hope. Wordlessly, she pulled the door wider. She wore an old sweater and a pair of jeans, a casualness that made Damien's crisp suit feel absurdly formal. He saw shadows of exhaustion under her eyes, as if the responsibilities of single motherhood weighed heavily. Before he could speak, a small figure stepped into view behind her, half hiding behind her leg. Damien's breath caught. The child, presumably Jackson, clutched a bright red plastic car and blinked warily at the imposing stranger on the porch. The hush that fell in that tiny foyer pressed inward, as though the entire house held its breath in anticipation. A father meeting his son for the first time, an event neither had dared script nor could fully prepare for. Tamsin recovered first. She mustered a faint smile, stepping back to let Damien inside. The place was modest but inviting, cluttered with toys, crayons, and a small Christmas tree in the corner, lights twinkling in the daytime gloom. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, watching as Damien set aside his usual poised mask, scanning the little living room. "I wasn't sure if you... I didn't know how soon you'd want to meet him." Her voice trailed off. He, too, was at a loss, tearing his gaze from the cozy disarray to regard Jackson. The child stared back, equal parts curiosity and caution. The hush stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Damien cleared his throat. "Hi, Jackson," he began, unable to keep his voice from rasping. He tried on a gentle smile, alien in a face more used to frowns and boardroom scowls. My name is Damien. Your mom told me about you. I guess I'd like to be a friend. If that's okay." The child frowned a little, chewing his lip. "You have a car waiting outside?" he asked, voice small. "It's big and black. I saw it through the window." Damien nodded awkwardly. "Yes, that's mine." Jackson clung to Tamsin's pant leg for a moment longer, then took a hesitant step forward, as though the mention of a fancy car piqued a 5-year-old's sense of awe. Tamsin's eyes glistened, but she pressed her lips together, letting the two find their footing. "Would you like to see my new crayons?" Jackson ventured, shaking the toy car in his hand as though bridging the gap between them. Damien's heart pounded with inexplicable warmth. "Yes," he managed, voice husky, "I'd like that." And so they slipped into the living room, where Tamsin coaxed Jackson into showcasing his scribbles of cars and trucks. Damien sat stiffly on a small couch, feeling painfully large in the modest space, but humbled by the child's bright commentary. Soon, the hush of tension morphed into a subdued curiosity as Jackson prattled on about his favorite TV show, about wanting a dog someday, about how big the city was. Damien realized with a jolt that this was the first real conversation he'd ever had with a child, let alone his own. It was disarming, the simplicity of the boy's world, the raw sincerity of each question. "Do you like dogs, Mr. Damien?" Jackson asked, tilting his head. Damien swallowed a flash of an unsteady laugh. I never had one, but maybe," he replied, acutely aware that fatherhood might mean partaking in these whimsical dreams. Meanwhile, Tamsin watched from the kitchen doorway, arms folded, face etched with tension and the slightest glimmer of relief. At last, when Jackson shuffled off to rummage for more show-and-tell items in his bedroom, Tamsin joined Damien on the couch, her posture guarded but her gaze flicking to him with cautious gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, voice throbbing with emotion. "I know this must be enormous. If it's too much, say so, and we'll find a path that respects your boundaries but also doesn't hurt Jackson." Damien turned his head, face taut with the swirl of feelings he rarely let free. "I can't just walk away," he stated simply, "not when I see how innocent he is, how he's missed out on a father's presence because of me, or because of our parted ways. If you'll let me, I'd like to do more than just send checks. I'd like to actually be there." Tamsin's guarded expression cracked with an uncertain smile. She placed a hand over his. "He's been waiting for that, even if he didn't know it. We can try. But your world, your business, the tabloids, I'm worried they'll devour him if they learn who he is. I can't have that. He's just a child." The hush that followed underscored the seriousness of her words. Damien nodded, guilt flaring. Of course his name, his influence, came at a cost. "I'll do everything to protect him," he vowed. "I'm not naive about the press. But maybe we can keep him out of the spotlight until we figure out how to handle it. Step by step." Before she could respond, Jackson bounded back in, arms clutching a battered stuffed dinosaur. The hush shattered into sweet, childish chatter as he insisted on introducing his stuffed pal to Damien. Though part of him still reeled from the shock, Damien forced a gentle interest, something akin to paternal warmth lighting in his eyes as he asked the dinosaur's name, listening with quiet fascination to the boy's imaginative details. Tamsin observed them with relief that shook her core. She had feared Damien would be cold, dismissive. But the man stooping to examine a battered toy, offering sincere if awkward compliments to a wide-eyed child, was not the aloof CEO she'd read about in business journals. The visit ended with a promise from Damien to return soon, once he sorted out the avalanche of new responsibilities. Jackson waved a wide grin, the uncertain hush replaced by a boy's excited yelp, "Come back tomorrow, okay?" Tamsin walked Damien to the door, heart pounding anew as she realized how fragile and vital their new understanding was. On the threshold, Damien gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Thank you," he murmured, voice thick. "We'll figure this out. I won't let either of you down." She nodded, tears stinging her eyes, letting him exit into the crisp winter air. As the black car purred away down the tranquil street, Tamsin stood in the hush of her living room, arms wrapped around herself as Jackson tugged on her pant leg, demanding more crayons or a snack. The hush inside her now thrummed with cautious optimism. Father and child had met, and for the first time in 5 long years, her burden felt shared. Yet she could not deny the dread of how swiftly the public eye might descend upon them, or how formidable Damien's rivals and her own estranged family could be. Still, the hush that replaced fear with fragile hope gave her courage. She gazed at Jackson's bright face, recalling the surprised softness in Damien's eyes, and thought that perhaps, amid the swirl of challenges, they had all found a promise of belonging. In the days that followed his first meeting with Jackson, Damien found himself navigating uncharted emotional terrain with a mix of excitement and fear. The ironclad schedule he had maintained for years, his early morning calls with overseas investors, midday strategy sessions, and late-night conference calls, underwent a radical transformation as he carved out pockets of time to visit Tamsin's modest home. He was still the resolute CEO who commanded Lockhart Innovations with unwavering authority, yet he discovered an unexpected softness in himself each time he boarded his car, armed with a small gift or a new children's book he thought might amuse his son. Despite the swirl of business demands, he realized that, for the first time, his personal life was no longer an afterthought. Returning to Tamsin's neighborhood felt surreal, a calm, tree-lined enclave that bore no resemblance to the high-rise enclaves or sleek penthouses he frequented. More than once, on the drive over, Damien found himself questioning the fragility of what he was building. A father-son connection forged under the shadow of 5 absent years demanded patience and honesty. He was no stranger to forging alliances or outsmarting corporate rivals, but fatherhood required an emotional fortitude he had never cultivated. Still, the memory of Jackson's bright, trusting eyes stirred a fierce determination in him. If he could sustain the loyalty of employees and the trust of shareholders, he reasoned he should be able to earn the unwavering love of a 5-year-old boy. He arrived at Tamsin's home one late afternoon, soft sunlight trailing over the stoop. The hush that greeted him inside spoke of the comfortable routine Tamsin and Jackson shared, the faint shuffle of small feet on a rug, the gentle hum of a TV cartoon in the background. When the door opened, Jackson peered out, immediate delight lighting his features the moment he recognized Damien's tall form. "Mr. Damien. You came," the child exclaimed, bouncing on his toes. Damien's heart constricted, equal parts joy and remorse. He crouched to ruffle Jackson's hair, offering a quiet "of course," and a small bag of toy cars he'd picked up en route. The hush of Tamsin's half-smile behind Jackson spoke volumes. She was grateful for each step Damien took toward fatherhood, but tension still weighted her posture, as if she feared the other shoe might drop at any moment. Over the next hour, the living room filled with the mingled echoes of cartoon voices from the TV and the rumble of adult conversation. Damien sank onto the worn couch, experiencing a wave of foreign comfort in its homely cushions, a stark contrast to his sleek leather furnishings at home. Jackson pounced on the new toy cars with unabashed glee, racing them along the coffee table, while Tamsin perched nearby, sipping tea and observing father and son with guarded pride. Damien attempted small talk with Jackson about his day at school, discovering in the child an astonishing curiosity that rivaled the energy he brought to corporate negotiations. Jackson described a class art project, then asked Damien about big offices and fancy buildings. The hush that followed each of his wide-eyed questions was replaced by Damien's halting attempts to convey what a CEO actually did, and Jackson's ensuing barrage of whys left Damien more undone than any cunning investor ever had. Meanwhile, Tamsin excused herself to the kitchen. Damien heard her rummaging around, likely preparing a simple dinner or trying to give them space to bond. He found that each minute alone with Jackson defied the years they had lost. The hush that once pressed with awkwardness was replaced by laughter and the child's joyous squeals whenever Damien joined in building block towers or marveling at the heroes in some picture book. He felt a pang of regret each time Jackson turned those eager, trusting eyes on him, silent proof of how much innocence he had missed. Yet with every grin, every question, every small high five, Damien sensed a path opening. Maybe fatherhood wasn't so foreign a territory after all. If he dared to remain present, to welcome the hush of paternal vulnerability, he might be rewarded with a bond that overshadowed any corporate success. Eventually, Tamsin re-emerged with a tray of sandwiches and fruit. The hush that settled as they ate was gentle, the TV turned off so Jackson could regale Damien with more stories about his teacher and best friend. Tamsin, for her part, lingered at the edge, eyes scanning Damien's face for signs of reluctance or insincerity. Sensing her caution, he addressed her directly, "I can adjust my schedule, come by each week, or more often if you allow it. I'd like to be consistent." Let him know I'm not just a face that appears and disappears. The hush in Tamsin's stunned acceptance underscored how deeply she had doubted any real follow-through from him. Her grateful nod, shy smile, and the quiet tear glinting in her eye reminded him that she, too, was grappling with a radical shift in her world. She offered a suggestion that perhaps, in time, Jackson might visit Damien's penthouse or an office, though she worried about the boy's comfort in an alien environment. Damien found himself imagining a small boy's footsteps echoing through his stark, high-rise domain, filling the emptiness he had long tried to ignore. After dinner, with Jackson dozing off in front of a cartoon rerun, Damien and Tamsin talked quietly in the modest kitchen. She offered him tea, and they stood by the counter while the hum of an old refrigerator provided a soft background lull. Here, in this unassuming space, the hush felt profoundly intimate. He asked about her life these past years, how she managed to raise a child alone, what support she had from friends, if her family was around. Tamsin's gaze flickered with unresolved bitterness as she recounted being effectively cut off by relatives disapproving of her unplanned pregnancy. She'd built a life by working multiple jobs, forging a circle of supportive friends from her local church and the neighborhood. Damien listened, swallowing shame at the fact he had contributed nothing to that struggle. For a man who prided himself on financial savvy, the realization that he had unwittingly forced Tamsin to navigate motherhood alone hit him with fresh guilt. He apologized, voice taut with feeling, admitting it wasn't enough to say, "I'm sorry," but vowing to step up however he could. Tamsin nodded, watery gratitude in her smile, though caution still lingered in her posture. "We can't change the past," she said softly, "but if you can show Jackson genuine care now, that's all I want. I never intended to upend your life or undermine your success, but I won't apologize for letting you meet your own son." Her words, delivered firmly yet without malice, evoked a hush of humility in Damien's chest, a recognition that fatherhood was about more than genetics, it required presence, honesty, and a willingness to embrace daily chaos. As the hour grew late, Damien prepared to leave. Jackson, half asleep on the couch, stirred briefly, asking if Mr. Damien would come back soon. Damien crouched to tuck a blanket around him, feeling an unfamiliar sting in his eyes at the child's small, trusting face. He whispered that he would indeed return, ignoring the swirl of tension in his chest. Tamsin walked him to the door, the hush bearing the weight of goodbyes and renewed promises. She glanced at him, an unspoken question in her gaze. Could this improbable reconnection last, or would the hush of father and child's bond be shattered by the demands of a cutthroat world? He squeezed her hand softly at the threshold, speaking in a low tone that carried more conviction than any corporate vow. I'll come back, and soon. We'll figure out how to handle the press if it comes to that, but right now, my first concern is Jackson. Her relieved nod shone with a glimmer of hope she dared not fully name. With that, he stepped into the cold night, the hush inside replaced by the hush of stars overhead. In the back seat of his sedan, he couldn't resist pulling out his phone to glance at the photograph Tamsin had given him, Jackson beaming at the camera, eyes wide with possibility. Over the hum of the engine, Damien exhaled, letting the hush of fatherhood settle in. His empire, once his sole focus, now felt incomplete without the presence of that small boy's daily adventures. The hush that fell over him was not dread but an odd mixture of tenderness and determination. He had navigated corporate storms, outsmarted cunning rivals. Surely, bridging a 5-year gap in a child's life was not beyond him, if he faced it with honesty. As the sedan glided through the sleeping city, Damien made a silent vow that no hush of regret would overshadow what time remained for father and son to grow together. And so, he accelerated into the unknown, heart brimming with a sense of paternal longing he'd never expected to embrace. Damien Lockhart did not ease into fatherhood as gently as he would have liked. In the aftermath of first meeting Jackson, he found himself constantly distracted during corporate board meetings, his mind drifting from profit margins to the memory of the boy's face. Sleep became restless, the once quiet hush of his penthouse at night now seemed to amplify every distant hum of the city, reminding him of a small child asleep in a modest home across town. His top-level staff and senior executives noticed his uncharacteristic preoccupation. A few tried to pry discreetly, asking if everything was all right, if a major acquisition was causing him stress, only to receive curt reassurances. Damien refused to reveal the truth to anyone just yet, knowing how merciless the media and certain business rivals could be if they sniffed out a vulnerability as personal as a secret son. Despite his internal turmoil, the bond between him and Jackson grew with each passing visit. Twice in that same week, Damien returned to Tamsin's neighborhood, each arrival scattering the hush of monotony that once pervaded her household. The second time, he arrived armed with a puzzle set he'd picked from a quaint children's shop, uncertain if Jackson would prefer dinosaurs or space robots. Turned out, the boy loved both, squealing with delight at the puzzle's galaxy theme. Damien, no puzzle enthusiast himself, did his awkward best to help fit the oddly shaped pieces. Jackson found it hilarious whenever Damien got it wrong, which was often. Tamsin, smiling from the kitchen doorway, watched them spar in a gentle back-and-forth banter. One afternoon, Tamsin invited Damien to join them for a short trip to the local park. The idea both excited and unnerved him. It would be the first time father and son ventured into a public space together. He thought about possible photographers lying in wait, or curious neighbors who might question the presence of a well-known CEO in a small suburban park. Still, the longing to share a simple piece of everyday life with Jackson overrode his reservations. So off they went, Tamsin driving them in her old sedan, refusing Damien's politely offered chauffeur. The hush of the ride was broken by Jackson's excited chatter about the slide, the sandbox, and the swings. Damien, sitting in the passenger seat, tried to conceal how foreign this felt, just a man in a battered old car with a mother and child, heading to a park. At the park, Jackson sprinted off to the monkey bars, leaving Tamsin and Damien behind in a swirl of squealing children and tired parents. The hush of the corporate world he had always known was replaced by the chaotic harmony of shouts and giggles. Damien's suit jacket, which he stubbornly wore out of habit, felt out of place among parents in t-shirts chasing toddlers. An older woman on a bench recognized him, raising an eyebrow in passing, but said nothing. Tamsin eyed him with a light smirk, as if teasingly acknowledging how improbable it was to see the business titan in such a casual setting. He tried to relax his posture, following Jackson's bounding form. When the boy turned around, beckoning him to the slide, Damien caught himself actually hurrying, shoes crunching gravel, ignoring the mild ache in his knees as he crouched by Jackson to help him climb. The hush they shared in this moment carried no tension, only the promise of normalcy. In short bursts of excitement, Jackson demanded Damien time how long it took him to scale the climbing net, or push him on the swing until the boy squealed for more. At first, Damien was self-conscious, seeing himself as an oddity in this land of carefree children. Yet Tamsin's gentle presence, her occasional laughter, her suggestion that he relax, eroded his usual guarded stance. They ended up, to his own astonishment, sharing easy conversation with other parents, exchanging small talk about school hours and snack preferences. The hush that once cocooned Damien's private domain seemed to crack, letting in the bright voices of everyday life he had never thought to desire. When eventually Jackson tired, panting and sweaty with pure delight, the trio ambled back to the car. Tamsin took the wheel, Jackson strapped in the back seat, hugging a small plush rocket ship Damien had won for him at a vending machine. The hush of the drive, though short, bristled with a calm sense of belonging. Damien gazed out the window, listening to Jackson doze off mid-babble about the best sliding technique. Tamsin's profile in the rearview mirror appeared thoughtful, and every so often, she shot him a glance tinted with wary hope. This was fatherhood in fleeting snapshots, but fatherhood nonetheless, and Damien felt equal parts awe and shame at how late he had come to it. Back at Tamsin's house, after a quick snack, Jackson slumped against the couch, drifting into a brief nap. The hush that followed was tinted with the lull of afternoon sunshine peeking through the curtains. Damien removed his jacket, folding it neatly on a chair, then joined Tamsin in the small kitchen. There, with the hum of an ancient fridge and the faint aroma of leftover soup, they finally had the chance for a quieter talk. She shared small triumphs and challenges of raising a child alone, the nights Jackson cried from nightmares, the proud moment when he first spelled his own name, the heartbreak of seeing other kids with two parents. Damien offered halting sympathies, contrition lacing his every word. That hush weighed heavier when she mentioned the financial hardships she had quietly endured, refusing to chase him for child support. "I didn't want you to think I was taking advantage," she said softly. "And maybe I was too proud." Damien's chest tightened, guilt surging anew. He vowed not only to help from now on but to ease her burdens in ways that respected her independence. The hush that followed was broken by her half-laugh, half-sigh, acceptance shadowed by lingering caution. Then he asked, with great care, if she was comfortable with Jackson eventually visiting his penthouse or spending a weekend there. "I'd like him to know my world too, though I worry about cameras," he admitted. Tamsin studied his face, clearly weighing trust against fear. "We'll see how he adjusts," she replied softly. "I just want him safe. If the media or your corporate rivals discover him, he'll be thrust into an attention he's not ready for. But if it means forging a real bond with his father, I'm open, step by step." Damien exhaled a subtle relief. The hush that cloaked them now was less fraught, as though forging a plan or compromise had softened the emotional tension. As Jackson stirred from his nap, they rejoined him for a quiet early dinner, nothing elaborate, but filled with boisterous questions from the little boy about what chips CEOs eat in their fancy offices. Damien found himself laughing at the innocence, the hush replaced by the bubble of a small child's imagination. By the time he rose to leave, the winter sky outside had begun to cast long shadows, the hush of dusk settling over the quiet street. Jackson clung to his leg, whining about him not staying longer, which both warmed and saddened Damien's heart in ways he had never experienced. Tamsin gently peeled the boy away, reassuring him that Mr. Damien would return soon. Damien knelt, pressing a hand to the child's shoulder and promising the same. On the threshold, Tamsin and Damien exchanged an unspoken understanding, though each carried anxieties about the future, they were forging a path hand in hand for the sake of their little boy. She murmured a hushed goodbye, eyes glistening with a subdued gratitude. Damien lingered one more second, studying the modest living room with toys scattered about, proof of a normalcy he realized he had been craving. Then he pivoted back into the hush of the night, stepping into his waiting car with a new sense of direction. The hush in the vehicle felt different this time, not a lonely emptiness but a calm possibility. He resolved that in the coming weeks, he would carefully juggle his corporate demands with the fatherly role he had so unexpectedly discovered. Yes, it would mean stepping out of the hush of his penthouse to pick Jackson up from day care on an occasional afternoon, or silently sorting crayons while the boy chatted happily at the kitchen table. It would mean forging a new hush, one that replaced the sterile hush of sealed-off emotions with a hush of contentment found in a child's trust. And though Tamsin's worried eyes reminded him that storms could come from any direction, tabloids, family disputes, corporate schemers, Damien found himself no longer averse to risking his fortress of solitude. The hush that carried him through the city's bright evening lights was the hush of a father's resolve, a hush of hope that, come what may, he would not abandon the newfound bond with the little boy who had so unexpectedly opened his carefully guarded heart. A light snow blanketed the city as Damien found himself juggling more spinning plates than ever before. Between meetings with major investors, who remained blissfully unaware of his new parental role, and the hush of paternal duties he had undertaken to keep a presence in Jackson's life, he discovered that time itself felt compressed. Early mornings that once belonged solely to scanning financial reports were now divided between phone calls to Tamsin, scheduling pickups and drop-offs for Jackson, and hurried discussions with his head of security about how to shield the boy from any paparazzi whiff. After all, Damien Lockhart, the formidable CEO who dominated business columns, did not want his newly discovered 5-year-old to become tabloid fodder. He tried to maintain an air of normalcy at Lockhart Industries, yet longtime staffers sensed the subtle transformation in his demeanor. Damien's usual briskness softened occasionally, especially when his phone buzzed with a new text from Tamsin, updating him on Jackson's day. On more than one occasion, an employee found him in the office lounge checking children's book recommendations on his phone, an act that seemed surreal for a man who had seldom displayed personal vulnerability. Word circulated quietly among certain trusted aides that perhaps the boss had discovered a more human side, though no one dared question him directly. Damien, for his part, was grateful for their hush, the tacit acceptance that personal revelations were his to divulge, or not, in his own time. Meanwhile, Tamsin navigated her own swirl of pressures. She had restructured her work schedule at the local community center, in part to ensure she could accommodate these new father and son meetups. Though relieved that Damien seemed earnest about forging a true relationship with Jackson, she still harbored anxiety. How long until a corporate rival or an overzealous journalist caught wind of the boy's existence and spun it into a sensational story? The hush of her little home felt less secure, weighed down by the knowledge that her child's life might be upended if the wrong eyes discovered Damien's presence. And in quieter moments, she struggled with a new wave of emotions, a mixture of lingering affection for the man she had once known, mingled with wariness that he might vanish if fatherhood proved too demanding. Jackson, on the other hand, sensed only the blossoming wonder of having a father figure. Each time Damien arrived, whether in the hush of an evening with a dinner bag or on a bright Saturday afternoon with a small educational toy, the child's face lit up as though the sun had emerged from behind clouds. Damien discovered a joy in everyday tasks he had never fathomed, helping Jackson fill out coloring pages, listening to him stumble through early reading attempts, or simply sharing a silly children's show on Tamsin's well-worn couch. The hush that once marked Damien's cold professionalism gave way to laughter, childlike conversation, and a subtle warmth that made Tamsin's living room feel more like home than any penthouse suite could. Yet with closeness came the threat of scrutiny. On one unremarkable Wednesday morning, Tamsin returned from picking Jackson up at preschool to find a man leaning against a sedan across the street. He wore the practiced casual air of a photographer attempting to blend in. Alarm clenched her gut as she hustled the boy inside, ignoring the man's apparent attempt to snap a photo from a distance. She phoned Damien, voice shaky, describing the man and the unsettled feeling that watchers might be closing in. Damien cursed under his breath, half expecting that the rumor mill or an ambitious paparazzo had decided to investigate. "Stay indoors for now," he told her, tone taut with protective fury. "I'll send my security to check the area, and we'll discuss how to handle the press if they force a confrontation." That evening, after an impromptu board meeting, Damien arrived at Tamsin's home with two discreet security professionals in tow, men who had once guarded him at corporate summits. Tamsin looked both comforted and overwhelmed. The hush grew heavy as they conferred in the small living room, discussing how to shield Jackson from unwanted attention. Jackson, perched on the couch with a coloring book, stole anxious glances at the quiet men in suits, evidently sensing the tension. Damien knelt by his side, explaining gently, "They're just friends who help me. Like guardians. Nothing scary." The hush that replaced Jackson's uncertain expression reflected a child's faith. If his father said it was okay, then he would trust it for now. As Tamsin and Damien spoke in the kitchen about future contingencies, the hush was punctured by her tears. She voiced fears of her controlling relatives or the dogged paparazzi haunting Jackson's doorstep. Damien wrapped an arm around her with a resolve that surprised them both. "I refuse to let them drag our child's name through scandal," he vowed, voice firm. "If need be, I'll publicly acknowledge him in a controlled manner, on my own terms. This hush, this cloak of secrecy, can't last if it means more shadows for Jackson. But we'll do it carefully, ensuring he's protected, not thrust into the spotlight." Tamsin nodded, tears of relief sliding down her cheeks. Over the next few hours, they hammered out a plan. Damien would speak with his communications team, under a strict confidentiality clause, and set up a possible, public statement that recognized Jackson without sensationalizing the story. They would aim to keep his location and everyday life out of media crosshairs. Tamsin, though anxious, saw no alternative. Sooner or later, the tabloids might sniff out the truth, and better to face it head-on than cower until a sensational headline tore them apart. The hush that followed was heavier than ever, tinged with both dread and a faint glimmer of hope that honesty, carefully handled, might be kinder than endless secrets. With the plan in place, they eased the tension for Jackson's sake. Damien found himself on the floor with the boy again, rummaging through building blocks for a hasty fortress that Jackson insisted was dragon-proof. Tamsin looked on with a subdued smile, arms folded around her waist. In that hush, father and son's laughter wove a gentle tapestry of belonging, overshadowing the swirl of adult conspiracies they were forced to consider. The hush of the living room felt less foreboding, more like a sanctuary. Eventually, the security men stepped outside, concluding their sweep of the area. Damien prepared to leave, pressing a quick, reassuring kiss to Tamsin's cheek. Her eyes widened at the spontaneous intimacy, but she didn't pull away. The hush there, in the doorway, glowed with a fragile sense of unity. Jackson, half dozing on the couch, waved sleepily, acceptance shining in the hush of a child's adoration. The drive back to the penthouse was a swirl of city lights and colder reflections. Damien clutched the steering wheel of his sleek sports sedan. He had dismissed his chauffeur for the night, needing solitary reflection. The hush in that car was thick with unspoken emotion, the vow to safeguard Jackson, the paternal love that blindsided him daily, the realization that to do right by his son, he might have to step into a public role he abhorred. By the time he parked in the subterranean garage, he exhaled a tremulous breath, bracing for what the next few weeks might bring. In his mind, he replayed Jackson's giggle as they built that makeshift dragon-proof fortress, resolving that no matter the hush of scandal, no matter the threat of corporate foes or prying cameras, he would not break that child's trust. For the hush that accompanied fatherhood was far more precious than any silence wealth or power had ever afforded him. An uneasy lull settled over Damien's life in the week after he and Tamsin devised their plan to protect Jackson's privacy. Each morning, Damien steeled himself for the possibility that some media outlet might break the story of his hidden son, or that a paparazzo would appear outside Tamsin's home. Yet no major headlines emerged, just a few speculative whispers in certain business rumor columns. He seized this momentary calm to deepen his bond with Jackson, quietly weaving fatherhood into his routine. After finishing the day's last round of corporate calls, Damien often found himself behind the wheel at twilight, driving toward Tamsin's cozy neighborhood in the hush of cold winter evenings. By the time he arrived, Jackson would be peering excitedly out the window, face lit with pure delight at the sight of his father's car. That simple image washed away the tension swirling through Damien's day. During these visits, Tamsin guided Damien through the intricacies of bedtime routines that had once been foreign to him, the timing of Jackson's bath, the stories that lulled him toward sleep, the small rituals of ensuring a favorite stuffed dinosaur stood guard at the foot of the bed. Damien, so used to orchestrating corporate expansions and negotiating with cunning dealmakers, stumbled endearingly over these domestic tasks, misreading bedtime cues, handing Jackson the wrong blanket, or losing track of which pajamas the boy liked best. Yet Jackson was patient, giggling at his father's clumsy attempts to tuck him in properly. Bit by bit, Damien discovered that fatherhood offered a warmth and authenticity he had never felt in the sterile hush of boardrooms. Each bedtime story he narrated, each playful banter over a cartoon, replaced the gnawing emptiness in his penthouse with a sense of human connection that money could not replicate. Meanwhile, Tamsin's reservations began to thaw under the steady assurance Damien projected. She recognized that behind his polished exterior and commanding presence lay a man earnestly trying to atone for lost time. Still, the hush of her own worries never fully lifted. She often glanced out the window whenever a strange car passed or rummaged through the day's mail with dread, expecting unsolicited letters from her estranged relatives or unscrupulous reporters. Late at night, after Jackson dozed off, she and Damien would talk in hushed tones on the living room couch, cups of lukewarm tea cradled in their hands. Their conversations veered between everyday banter, like the silly thing Jackson said at daycare, and the looming specter of a future where corporate adversaries or meddling tabloids could exploit the child's existence. Every time Tamsin shuddered at the possibility, Damien pressed a reassuring hand to her arm, promising her that his security team would remain vigilant, that he would not allow Jackson's name to become a sideshow in a media circus. In one particularly intimate moment, Tamsin worked up the nerve to ask about Damien's family. She recalled once reading a brief biography mentioning that he had little contact with his own parents, who had relocated abroad years earlier. Was he lonely before he discovered Jackson? Damien hesitated, voice thickening as he confessed that loneliness was the hush he had grown accustomed to, filling it with business conquests, philanthropic gestures, but never letting anyone close. Even the romantic liaisons he had engaged in had been fleeting, overshadowed by the demands of his empire. Tamsin's eyes glistened, empathy bridging the hush. She admitted her own loneliness, raising a child without paternal support. In that gentle exchange, they found a thread of mutual understanding, forging a deeper emotional closeness than either expected when they'd first reconnected at the winter gala. Yet, as days blurred into nights, the hush that bound them also heralded trouble. Damien's top security advisor discreetly informed him that suspicious inquiries had been made by certain tabloid publications, sniffing around for confirmation of the rumored love child. Nothing had been published yet, but the swirl of hush from those phone calls indicated that some story was brewing. Damien wrestled with conflicting instincts. On one hand, he wanted to preempt any sensational headlines by giving a measured statement. On the other, he feared that acknowledging Jackson publicly might bring exactly the sort of media scrutiny Tamsin dreaded. He would lie awake, phone in hand, scanning the web for early hints of a scandal, fighting an unfamiliar panic that no strategic board maneuver could quell. This was his son, no intangible investment or brand expansion, but flesh and blood. Finally, near the close of that turbulent week, Tamsin broached the topic first. Jackson had begun asking more direct questions about Damien's shiny office and tall building, apparently curious to see where Daddy works. Hearing the boy refer to him so casually as Daddy disarmed Damien entirely. The hush that followed each mention was a gentle testament to the father-son bond blossoming. Yet Tamsin asked with quiet trepidation if it would be possible for Jackson to visit Damien's penthouse. "He's pressing me," she admitted. "He wants to see your world, and I can't keep telling him we'll do it, someday, forever. But are you ready for that? Is it safe for him?" The hush that enveloped their conversation bristled with the worry that prying eyes or business associates might discover Jackson's presence the moment he stepped into Damien's high-profile environment. Damien, though anxious, found himself wanting to share that part of his life with his son. He nodded slowly, determination overshadowing fear. He laid out a plan: one quiet Sunday morning, no staff or guests, only a discreet security guard ensuring the building's paparazzi back door was clear. Tamsin could drive up through the private underground garage, stepping out with Jackson into an elevator that led straight to Damien's penthouse. They'd share a simple lunch or maybe watch a family movie on the large screen. It would be, in some small measure, a piece of fatherly normalcy, bridging their hush-laden suburban visits and his unrelenting corporate sphere. Tamsin consented, relief edging her voice, while a ripple of excitement coursed through Damien at the notion of Jackson's eager footsteps tapping over the marbled floors that had once seemed so empty. Thus, fatherhood crept further into Damien's domain, weaving a hush that replaced lonely nights with the echoes of a child's laughter. And as that hush of possibility grew, so did the fragile knowledge that everything might yet be shattered by outside forces. For now, though, each new day that Damien spent playing with Jackson, marveling at the trust in the boy's eyes, reaffirmed his will to protect this bond. If the hush that overshadowed them meant the hush of unspoken dangers lurking, it also signified the hush of a paternal devotion too fierce to be quashed. Damien woke on Sunday morning to a hush in his penthouse that felt different from the usual crisp quiet of his corporate fortress. This hush carried the echo of a little boy's laughter, a promise of small footsteps soon to echo on the marble floors. No urgent emails or urgent calls consumed him that day. He had dismissed his usual staff, informed security to maintain a discreet watch on the building's back entrance, and given strict orders that no visitors were to be allowed except for one small family. He found himself glancing often at the door, heart thrumming with a peculiar mix of exhilaration and dread. By mid-morning, his phone buzzed, Tamsin, texting that she and Jackson were en route, traffic was light, so they'd arrive soon. Damien pressed his lips together, scanning the pristine living room. He had fussed far too long over how to transform the sleek, black and chrome decor into something inviting for a 5-year-old. Ultimately, the best he could manage was an array of bright throw pillows, which looked comically out of place on his immaculate sofa, and a small corner table piled with children's books and snacks he'd nervously purchased. Stepping to the wall of floor-to-ceiling windows, he gazed at the cityscape that spread beneath him, feeling for once a sense of vulnerability in the face of everyday fatherhood. Finally, the private elevator chimed. Damien turned, pulse accelerating as the doors slid open. Tamsin emerged first, wearing a simple sweater and jeans, her expression caught between caution and a hopeful smile. Then came Jackson, peeking around her, wide-eyed at the gleaming marble underfoot and the breathtaking view beyond the penthouse's windows. "Wow," the boy breathed, voice carrying a hush of awe. "It's so high." He clutched Tamsin's hand, though curiosity danced in his eyes. Damien stepped forward, his usual businesslike stride wavering with nerves. "Hey," he said softly, offering the faintest grin. "Welcome to my home." He guided them inside. The hush that had once spelled loneliness now brimmed with Jackson's excited questions. Did planes fly below them? Why did the floor shine so much? Tamsin gave a short, relieved laugh, teasing, "Maybe you should consider a rug, so he doesn't slip and crack his head." Damien nodded sheepishly, leading them on a short tour of the main living area. Jackson trailed behind, enthralled by the glass wall that showcased the entire city. At one point, the boy pressed a hand against the window, marveling at the tiny cars below. "They look like toy cars," he exclaimed, turning bright eyes up at Damien. The unexpected normalcy of the situation nearly overwhelmed Damien. He was used to visitors who came as clients, colleagues, or potential partners, each well-versed in corporate politesse. Now, a small child was skipping across his expensive marble, eager to see if there were more rooms or an actual playground inside. Tamsin, trailing a bit, offered Damien a tight smile. He interpreted it as gratitude for his effort, and maybe an unspoken apology that his penthouse was hardly child-friendly. Over the hush of vacuum-sealed windows, they heard Jackson's exclamations echo, filling the penthouse with an energy alien to the hush that had once reigned. Damien had arranged a simple lunch, prepared by a chef who had quietly left a few hours earlier. Mini sandwiches, fresh fruit, and a bit of mac and cheese, just in case. They settled in the smaller dining nook rather than the formal dining table that spanned half a room. Jackson climbed into a chair, eyes darting about with unstoppable curiosity. "Daddy, did you build all this?" he asked. The word "daddy" still stirred a warm ache in Damien's chest. He had to pause a moment before responding. "Not quite," he replied with a gentle smile, "but I earned the money to buy it, yes. I do business so people can use new technology or better services. Then I get paid." Jackson furrowed his small brow. "So you're like a boss?" Tamsin hid a grin behind her glass of water, letting Damien handle the playful interrogation. He cleared his throat. "Yes, I guess. But it's more complicated than that." The hush that followed was punctured by the child's bright giggle. "Mama always says grown-ups talk complicated," Jackson declared. After lunch, they settled in the living area, where Tamsin coaxed Jackson into flipping through the children's books Damien had purchased. The hush between father and mother held a sense of tranquility, though they both remained watchful for any sign of unwelcome visitors. Jackson eventually found a racing game on a tablet. Damien, though uncomfortable letting children rely on gadgets, tried to moderate the boys' excitement, explaining how the game worked. Tamsin perched on a nearby sofa, arms folded around her knees, wearing an expression of tentative relief. This was, in a small measure, the life she had imagined for her son: a father's love, a safe environment, shared laughter. Of course, the hush could not last forever. Mid-afternoon brought a subdued alarm from Damien's phone, his head of security calling to inform him of multiple suspicious paparazzi lingering near the building's rear gate. Tamsin's eyes flickered with alarm when he told her, hush falling on Jackson's joyous exclamations about the game. She pulled him aside, telling him quietly they might need to leave soon, but the boy's crestfallen face threatened to undo Damien's efforts. Furious at the press, he stepped away, phone pressed to his ear, ordering his security to hold them off, ensuring Tamsin's car could exit without harassment. They only had minutes to orchestrate an exit plan that kept the child's face from being plastered on tabloids. When he returned to the living area, Tamsin's posture was tense. She mustered an apologetic look. "I guess we should go before they get any pictures." She helped Jackson gather his coat, the hush thickening with disappointment. Damien knelt to level with his son. "I promise we'll do this again soon," he said softly, ignoring the pinch in his chest at the boy's disappointed nod. "I just need to keep you safe from cameras that want to take pictures without asking." Jackson frowned. Why would they want pictures of me? This question, so innocent, nearly broke Damien's composure. He exchanged a pained glance with Tamsin, then forced a light tone. "Because your dad is, sort of a famous boss. But we'll make sure they don't bother you, okay?" In the hush that followed, Jackson brightened slightly, trusting the reassurance. Tamsin ushered him to the elevator, pausing at the threshold to face Damien. Their eyes met, a mutual understanding flickering. This hush was the best they could salvage in a swirl of prying eyes. He gripped her hand in a quick, supportive squeeze, murmuring, "I'll call you tonight. I'm sorry it ended so soon." Her sad smile spoke volumes: regret, acceptance, and unwavering determination to protect Jackson. Then the elevator doors slid shut, carrying them away, leaving Damien alone with the hush of his penthouse once again. But that hush now felt altered, less lonely than it had once been, though overshadowed by the knowledge that external forces threatened to intrude. He stood by the windows, gazing at the city while his phone blinked with multiple missed calls from subordinates. Some crisis demanded his attention, but the hush in his heart told him fatherhood demanded it more. He opened the phone's messaging app, sending Tamsin a brief note, "Thank you for today. I'm sorry about the paparazzi scare. We'll find a safe way to be together, I promise." Then he sank into the plush sofa, eyes stinging with a mixture of anger at the prying media and a fierce paternal love that insisted this hush was worth defending. In the hush of late afternoon, his mind drifted to future possibilities: Jackson coming over for a whole weekend, father and son traveling somewhere safe from cameras, or perhaps standing united in a carefully controlled public statement that recognized Jackson. Such steps were daunting, but in that hush, a father's vow echoed: he would not let the tabloids, or the hush of corporate intrigues, rob them of the bond they were finally forging. Shadows lengthened across the penthouse floor as dusk approached, but for once, in that hush, Damien felt a guiding sense of purpose, no longer to conquer markets alone, but to conquer the hush of secrecy and fear so that a small boy named Jackson could laugh openly in the presence of his father.